Hi, everybody. Today, you are going to be practicing for the first time, really officially, the quantitative analysis FRQ. And this is the second FRQ that you will write on the AP test in May. So I'm going to kind of break this down a little bit, and we're going to do one as practice because for your checkpoint assessment, you are going to be given a quantitative analysis. So before we begin, what you will need for this particular assignment is to not only have this video up, but also just make sure that you have copied over page 11 into your own digital notebook, because page 11 is going to be what we are completing throughout this video today. So I wanted to start the video off with a couple of reminders on verbs, because what we've talked about so far, we've developed an argument and we've compared and contrasted Supreme Court cases. Really, what we see in quantitative analysis are going to be three big verbs that I wanted to just remind you guys about. So identify. You will always, for the most part, see an identify in one of these questions. And with this is really straight to the point, guys. You're going to provide a specific term, concept, data that College Board is looking for. And this is your really short and sweet one sentence. Make sure it's a complete sentence. You won't get credit if it's not complete, but make sure that it's really not, it doesn't need to be too long. Now, you will hear me talk about in this video using something called a spare tire. So think about what a spare tire's purpose is, right? It's if you lose a tire, one pops, right? You get a hole in it, you have a backup, okay? That's the same way you can think of it when you're writing these FRQs. You can add what we call spare tires in case the original answer that you provide is incorrect. So you can add a spare tire in the identify as well. So if you're kind of unsure or you would like that backup, you could identify maybe two things. Okay. Describe is another of the verbs that you will see quite a bit. This is kind of a gray area because it's not really one sentence, and it's a little bit more involved than, identify or define. But you're going to provide details, characteristics about a concept or phenomenon. So usually describe is going to be 2 to 3 sentences. It doesn't have to be super long, but remember, you're going to want to support everything you can with evidence and examples, right? I would say the only time you're not going to do that is for the identify, okay? So give a general description when you're describing, define major terms, and then support that with evidence and details and examples, because that will make your answer that much stronger. And then explain is the most common verb on the AP test, and that's why we practice it so much in class. So remember, explain, you are actually connecting things. You are using transition phrases like because, this shows, this proves. So for that reason, this is a little bit of a longer answer. You should be thinking it should probably be about 3 to 5 sentences, if not more. You're providing information about how and why a relationship exists, why a process or how a process exists, why the pattern exists, right? Explaining these situations and outcomes using evidence and reasoning. So again, you want to include examples and evidence in your answer to make it stronger. Now, a good explanation always has at least those 2 parts: identifying the factors or reasons why something has occurred, and then 2, supporting it with evidence. And you can use that ACE method that we've been talking about in class, right? Answer the question. So identify, what the relationship is, provide an example, and explain, or cite an example and explain, right? Tie it back to the prompt. Now, for the quantitative analysis FRQ, it is a 4-point FRQ. You will be given a graphic of some sort. That could be a table, a chart, a map, something about data, right? This is quantitative, Okay. The first thing that you are going to do is identify or describe the data in the graph. And usually that's 1 point. Okay. That is very straight to the point. The second thing you will be asked to do is to describe a pattern, a trend, or a similarity or difference. You don't have to explain that yet. It's just asking you to describe. The third point comes from then you talking about basically thinking about a conclusion about why that pattern exists or why that trend exists or why is there a similarity and difference. Okay, so that is your third point. And then 4 points, your fourth point is earned by explaining how data in the graph demonstrates a concept or principle. And that's where you're kind of tying in some other course content as well. Now, this is not an essay. You don't need a thesis. You don't need an introduction or a conclusion. You're simply answering those verbs. So when you're writing, you'll label parts A, B, C, D, your 4 points, and you will go and answer the question. Just make sure you do skip a line in between each section. Now, on your page 11, this is the chart that you should see. And you guys are going to be practicing this quantitative analysis with this diagram. And this is a chart showing you the percent of people or percent who believe the issue should be a top priority in 2019 by political party affiliation. So you've got Republican issues and Democratic issues, and now it's your turn to interpret the data in this graph. So take a moment and pause if you need to, just kind of digest the graph, take a look at it, figure out what it's saying to you. Okay. Now let's practice. Using your chart on page 11, answer the questions. So let's start with A. A says to identify the issue that the greatest percentage of Democrats believe should be a top priority in 2019. So pause this video before you move on, pause the video, take a look at your graph, and record your response to part A on your page 11. And when you're finished, resume the video and continue watching. Okay, so at this point, you should have written your answer for part A. Identify the greatest or the issue that the greatest percentage of Democrats believe should be a top priority in 2019. Now, this is an identify, so this should be a very straightforward answer. It should be one sentence. Now, I wanted to break down the graph or this table for you so we can talk about it later. Now, when you were looking for your answer, right, you were looking for Democratic issues. And your Democratic issues are going to be this gray triangle here. Now, what you'll notice on both of the axes are percentages or numbers that indicate percentages of how important that issue is for that political party. Okay, so you should have been focusing your attention down here. Okay, now you'll notice that the middle is split and it's white here. And there are some characteristics or issues in the center. If you look at the graph, this is where Republicans and Democrats place roughly equal priority. So equal priority on jobs and Social Security. And then on the flip side, you have the black triangle that represents Republican issues, how important they feel the issue is on the axis here. Now, as a result, this is something we'll get into later, but the closer to the middle the issue is, right, you could argue that that is of some importance to both sides. Okay, so that will come into play later. But if we're looking at this question, part A, the issue with the greatest percentage of Democrats believe should be a top priority in 2019. The issue that the greatest percentage of Democrats believe should be a top priority is healthcare. Your answer for part A should include healthcare. And where you can find this, right, I said you should be looking in this gray triangle. You're simply looking for, okay, which issue is closest to 100? And that would be healthcare. Okay, that is the dot that is closest to the right side of that Democratic triangle. Okay. Now, part B is to describe a difference between Democrats and Republicans on which issues they believe should be a top priority. Okay, so just like last time, pause this video, look at your chart, answer the part B on your page 11, and then when you're ready, resume the video. Okay, so our question was to describe a difference between Democrats and Republicans on which issues they believe should be a top priority. Now, what I would do if I were writing this FRQ, the first thing I would do is I would say, okay, I'm going to maybe try and stay away from these issues because they're close to the middle of where Republicans and Democrats place equal priority. So me personally, I would go more toward your issues that are further away from the middle. But that's just a personal preference. You can do either. So, for example, you could have said something along the lines of Democrats tend to focus on social welfare policies, whereas Republicans tend to prioritize national security and defense. So, if we're looking at this chart, right, Democrats are going to focus on those social welfare programs like drug addiction, the poor and needy, education, Medicare, healthcare. All of those are social welfare policies, right? But if you look at the Republican side of things, you can see crime, military, immigration, terrorism. Those all deal with national security and defense. So honestly, something I would probably add to this would be those examples to support your answer. You could also talk about with this one, Democrats prioritize environmental and climate change issues. And that's what I was saying. I think it would be good if you went down here, right? Because that's far away from the Republican priorities. Climate change, right? Just about, we could say like 60%-ish of Democrats place greater priority on climate change versus, less than 25% of Republicans if you're looking at this graph. So we could talk about that, whereas Republicans concern themselves with public safety issues. Again, talking about kind of crime, military, immigration, right? Those have higher importance to Republicans than they do Democrats. And then just another example that you could talk about. There are probably many more. And if you guys have questions on if what you said is correct, please let me know. But another example you could say would be Democrats are concerned about race relations, whereas Republicans are concerned about immigration. So you're simply describing a difference, right? What is a difference between the issues up here and the issues down here? If you did that, odds are you get the point. Okay, part C is to now think about those differences and draw a conclusion about why the parties differ on those issues. So why is it that the Republicans are looking at the issues that we see and the Democrats are looking at the issues that we see? So again, take a moment, think about what you know about parties and ideology, and write your answer for part C. And when you're ready to move on, please resume the video. All right, part C, drawing a conclusion about why parties differ on the issues in the chart. You could have said something along the lines of the Democratic Party's base tends to include people who need or want the government to be more involved in addressing social issues than the Republican Party base. So this is kind of getting into ideology, right? Democratic Party, liberals. Liberals tend to favor larger government. More government involvement needs to be in place to protect people and provide social safety nets. And that is different from the Republican Party base, right? That is a conclusion you can make about why different issues are shown on both sides. Now, on the flip side, you could have also said the Republican Party tends to want the government to be less involved in social issues. So looking at that conservative ideology and more focused on increasing American power internationally and on economic growth. I would also include in these samples here examples from the chart, right? So for this one, something along the lines of the Democratic Party tends to want the government to be more involved in addressing social issues, like, for example, Social Security, welfare, education. Republican Party tends to want to focus on increasing American power internationally, as a result, wanting to increase funding for the national defense. focusing on terrorism and the war on terror as the prime issue or the most important issue facing America, right? Just to show the reader that you know the difference in ideology between these two parties. Honestly, something that could receive the point as well is you could just talk about the ideologies of these groups, right? Democrats adhere to a liberal ideological perspective, whereas the Republicans adhere to a conservative ideological perspective. I don't think this is the strongest answer. However, College Board does list it as an acceptable one. I would prefer, if I were grading it, I wouldn't give you the point. I would want you to explain and draw a conclusion about how liberal and conservative actually make it so that they have those different views. And then your final part here is part D. You're going to explain how the information in the chart could be used by candidates running for office. And I want you to try this one, do your best. I know we haven't talked about candidates, but think about if a candidate wants to win an election, how could they use this information to gain more votes or to actually get elected? So do your best, pause the video and answer, and resume when you're ready. All right, so explaining how the information in the chart could be used by candidates running for office. Candidates, and we could look at this a couple of ways. Let's say the candidate wants to appeal to a much broader coalition, a much broader voting base. Candidates running for office could emphasize their support of those issues that we saw in the middle of that chart, right? Middle, those two categories, jobs and Social Security, are issues that are basically seen as equal in priority to both Republicans and Democrats. So a candidate running for office might talk about those issues because it's likely to bring in more voters. They're likely to gain more of a support. Now, again, this is an explain. So you would want to say, right, they would want to emphasize their support for these issues because, right, how would that help them when they're running for office? That's the explain part of this. You're making a connection. Now, you could also say something like, Republican candidates can highlight issues such as terrorism to mobilize their base supporters, right? Because we talked about the Republican ideology tends to favor, or conservative ideology tends to favor national defense and the war on terror as a big threat. So you would say they're going to highlight these issues, talk about terrorism, because that will help them appeal to the broad base of Republican voters. And then on the flip side, Democratic candidates can emphasize climate change to mobilize their base supporters, right? We know that environmental issues are pretty important to liberals. So the Democratic candidates are going to talk about climate change and what they're going to do for climate change to try and get voters out to support them. So if you didn't do as great as you thought on this part, that's okay. We are going to practice this in the next couple of units. But it is always good to try and challenge yourselves. So at this point, that concludes the quantitative FRQ practice. Like I said, you will see one of these quantitative FRQs tomorrow on your checkpoint. It is going to be fairly similar to this one. So on this video, I'm going to add a question at the end, and I want you to answer how you did. So if you were scoring yourself on a rubric of 1 to 4, what would your score have been? Just like we did when we self-graded. And then please respond to the other question in Edpuzzle as well, in terms of if you have any questions that I can clarify about the quantitative analysis. So, like I said, we'll reach out if you have questions, fill in that question in Edpuzzle, and I will see you guys in class. See you later.